And welcome to the channel. In today's session we will be focusing on Kubernetes multi-container pod. We will try to cover all the aspects of Kubernetes multi-container pod. So let's get started. What exactly multi-container pod is and what is the use of this particular multi-container pod. So as in my previous video I have explained, so in Kubernetes we have different types of pods which can be created as per the requirement. Okay, so what are the different pods? The first pod goes here is called as single container pod. The second type of pod goes is called as multi-container, that is multi-container pod. Third is your sidecar container pod, and then there is something called as init container pod. There is one more type of pod that is called as a static pod. So it's not like that we create all the pods in one time. Depending upon the requirement we basically create. So in this particular section, in this particular topic, we're gonna be talking more about multi-container pod. Okay, what exactly multi-container pod is and what multi-container pod is going to help us with, and in what kind of situation we will be creating multi-container pod. So multi-container pod is a pod. So multi-container pod is a pod that contains more than one container running together in the same environment. Okay, and as you know from my previous lecture, a pod is the smallest deployable unit in Kubernetes, and for a multi-container pod, so a multi-container pod is a pod where we have minimum more than one or more than two containers are running. That is called as multi-container. And there why we will be creating this multi-container pod. We will be creating this multi-container pod when two or something like this, when two or when two, what is the reason why we will be creating this. Okay, so reasons for creating multi-container pod: when two or more containers need to work together or closely. Okay, so when there is a need where the another container or the container that should be running next to each other, in that situation we need to have multi-container, or in more precise, that can be called as in a tightly coupled architecture or tightly coupled application. So if you have any tightly coupled application, then you can use this particular multi-container pod concept. Multi-container pods are also useful. Multi-container are always useful in the application of sidecar containers. So if you need to have sidecar containers created, you can use multi-container pod, and the same goes with the init container. So on a very simple term, sidecar containers and init containers are also an example of multi-container pod, because they have more than one containers running in the pod. So for sidecar containers, so these can be the example of multi-container pods. Okay, now so let's go here and try to understand how they communicate with each other. So two containers in the same pod, basically they share the same IP address. So this is called as my pod, and these containers, so C1 and C2, both the containers inside the pod, they communicate on the local host. So they communicate like local host, and they will have unique number of ports. So let's suppose this particular container is using 8080, then this particular container will be using 8081. So how it will be? Container C1, container C1 will be exposed on localhost 8080, and container C2 will be exposed on localhost 808081. Okay, so two containers in the pod uses same IP but different port numbers they use. Okay, let me show you one example how can we create a multi-container pod, and how to check the logs of the multi-container pods, and how to check the details. How can we create a multi-container pod? So for creating a multi-container pod, I have written a manifest. If you can take a look here, so this is how it happens. So this is the API version, and multi-container pod is a pod basically having more than 2 containers. So can you see here? So in the container we have a name. The first container is going to be called as container A, and it is going to run a image called Nginx, and the another container is going this Nginx this container A will be running on the port number 8080, and container B will be running on port number 9090. So let's see how this happens. So kubectl apply -f, and then we will use multipod.yaml. So multipod.yaml. So this is the name of the file. So we can see a pod has been created. Let's find the pod. Kubectl get pod is the command to list all the pods running. Now you can see here there is a pod, and in this particular pod we will have the status showing 2 by 2. What exactly this means? It means in this particular pod we will have 2 containers, and both the containers are up and running. That is why the status of pod is showing running. Okay, now let's go and take a look to the logs. So kubectl describe the pod. Kubectl describe pod is the command to describe any pod, and then give the pod name. Just hit enter. Now you can see what exactly happened here. So when you describe a pod, you will see what is the name of the pod, in which namespace the pod is running. As of now you can see the pod is running in default namespace. So if you don't specify any namespace while creating any resource in Kubernetes, it will go and get created in the default namespace. It is using some of the default service accounts, and it has been scheduled on the worker node 2 and start date. Now this is what is important to understand. You can see there is a common IP address. There is no, so two different containers don't get a unique IP address. Both the containers will be using the same IP address on the port number. So you can see in the container tab there will be one container called as container A and another container called container B. So this is an example of multi-container where 2 containers running on the same pod using same IP but with a different port. So container A is running with port number 8080 and container B is also running on 9090. Okay, you can see both the containers are in a running state. So the state of the container here is showing is running, okay, and it is not showing any error. And if you come here and if you take a look to the event, so what happened basically, so whenever you have executed the command kubectl apply, so kubectl is basically a command line tool. It reads your kubeconfig file and finds the address of your kube API server, and kube API server will perform authentication, authorization and admission control, and after that it will transfer the request to the scheduler. Scheduler is basically the workload scheduling function in Kubernetes. We take the responsibility of assigning the pods to the nodes and inform the particular kubelet, particular node kubelet, and kubelet is basically called as primary node agent, which take the responsibility of downloading the image from Docker Hub and then creating the container on that particular node. So this is how we can create a multi-container pod. And if you want to take a look to the logs of the pod, what you can do, kubectl logs, and you have to specify the pod name. So you have to specify the pod name, and if you hit enter, what it will show, it will tell you key in this particular pod you will have two containers, which particular container logs you are interested. So let's suppose if I am interested in knowing the log of container A, I can go with this particular fashion. So this is called container A. If I hit enter, it will show me the container A log, and if I am interested in knowing the log B, I can go and check the logs like this B. So we can list we can see the logs of both the containers with this particular command. So that's it for this particular video. Thank you, and keep watching, and keep if you like the video, if you understood the concept of multi-container pod in Kubernetes, then please like, share the video in your IT circle, help me grow. Thank you.